Nobody tells you the truth about humans until it's too late. My name is Krelva, and I'm a Vexorian from the temperate moon colonies of Sector 9. When I arrived at the Galactic Military Academy, I thought I'd seen everything the universe had to offer. 4 years of preparatory training, countless simulations, and a genetic lineage that traced back to the finest warriors of my homeworld. I was ready, or so I believed, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the greatest fighters from across the known galaxy. The Academy station hung in orbit around Nexus Prime, a massive structure of chrome and composite metals that housed over 3,000 cadets from 217 different species. It was glorious, intimidating, and absolutely bristling with the kind of competitive energy that could either forge you into something remarkable, or break you into tiny forgettable pieces. Orientation day started like any other military function. Boring speeches, procedural briefings, and the inevitable sizing up of your fellow cadets. We stood in formation in the Grand Assembly Hall, a cavernous space with ceiling panels that simulated a star field. To my left stood a Quarian, all 8 feet of crystalline exoskeleton and barely contained aggression. To my right a Selthian female, her scales shimmering with that irritating iridescence they're so proud of. Everyone was impressive in their own way. Everyone was deadly in their own way. Everyone belonged here. Then he walked in, the human. At first I didn't even register what I was looking at. He was short, maybe 5 feet 9 inches in standard measurements, with a frame that seemed almost comically average compared to the physical specimens surrounding him. His skin was a light brown, his hair dark and cropped close to his skull, and his eyes were a rather unremarkable shade of brown. He wore the standard Academy uniform like everyone else, but on him it looked almost loose, like it was made for someone bigger. The name patch on his chest read Cross, Ethan, species designation human, planet of origin Earth. Earth. Oh sweet merciful stars, Earth. The laughter started almost immediately. It began as a low chuckle from somewhere in the Draconid section, then spread like a virus through the formation. Even some of the instructors, the hardened veterans who were supposed to maintain discipline, had trouble keeping the smirks off their faces. Earth, you see, was famous throughout the galaxy, but not for the reasons humans probably hoped. It was famous for being a backwater death world with a gravity rating of 9.8 meters per second square. Now, to put that in perspective, the average civilized world maintained a comfortable 6.2. Anything above 7.5 was considered excessive. Anything above 8 was classified as a high-gravity environment requiring environmental suits for most species. Earth clocked in at nearly 10. The Quarian next to me leaned down, his voice a grinding rumble of amusement. Did they run out of proper candidates? Are we now accepting entries from primitive death worlds? A Corthan behind us, all tentacles and bioluminescent patches, joined in with a sound that I can only describe as wet giggling. Look at it. It looks soft. Does Earth even have proper predators, or did this one evolve from scavengers? Ethan Cross stood perfectly still in formation, his expression neutral, his eyes forward. He didn't react to the mockery, didn't flinch at the insults. He simply stood there breathing normally, existing in a way that seemed almost defiant in its ordinariness. The head instructor, a massive Thorian named Commander Vorask, finally called the hall to order with a voice that could crack bulkheads. The laughter died down, but the damage was done. The human was marked, labeled, categorized as the weak link before training had even begun. I'll admit, I joined in the mockery, not out loud, but in my head I'd already written him off. High-gravity world or not, he looked fragile, he looked breakable, he looked like he'd wash out within the first month, sent back to his little blue planet with his tail between his legs, assuming humans even had tails. I'd learn soon enough just how catastrophically wrong I was. We all would, because nobody, and I mean nobody, tells you the truth about humans until you've seen them in action, until you've watched them do things that should be physically impossible, until you've realized that surviving on a death world doesn't just build muscle, it builds something far more terrifying. It builds monsters who don't even know they're monsters. Physical assessments began exactly 48 hours after orientation, which gave everyone plenty of time to settle into their barracks, form social hierarchies, and continue making fun of the human. Ethan Cross had been assigned to Delta Wing, same as me, which meant I had a front row seat to what I assumed would be his inevitable humiliation. The assessment facility was located in the lower decks of the station, a sprawling complex of training rooms, medical bays, and equipment that could accommodate the wildly different physiologies of the galaxy's species. The tests themselves were standardized, or as standardized as you could get when dealing with beings that ranged from methane breathers to crystalline silicon-based life forms. Cardiovascular endurance on species-appropriate treadmills, strength assessments using adjustable resistance machines, flexibility measurements in reaction time drills. Everything was calibrated to each species' homeworld conditions, which meant the Quarians lifted weights in 0.7 gravity while the Vexorians, like myself, worked at a comfortable 0.65. It was fair, scientific, and designed to measure each cadet against the baseline expectations of their own biology. I performed well, as expected. My cardiovascular scores placed me in the 78th percentile for Vexorians, and my strength numbers were even better. The instructors nodded approvingly, made notes on their data tablets, and moved me along. The Silthian girl from orientation, whose name I'd learned was Thessia, absolutely destroyed the flexibility tests, bending her body into configurations that made my joints ache just watching. The Quarian, a brute named Kraktor, lifted weights that would have crushed most species flat, his crystalline structure gleaming under the facility lights. Then came Ethan's turn. The human walked up to the assessment station with that same neutral expression, that same unremarkable gait. The testing administrator, a bored-looking Peluvian with too many eyes, barely glanced at him before consulting the datapad. Species, human. Homeworld gravity 9.8, adjusting environmental controls to 0.98 for baseline assessment. Someone in the observation gallery actually laughed out loud. 0.98 was just a hair under Earth standard, which meant this test would be conducted at nearly 50% higher gravity than what most of us considered normal. The environmental generators hummed, and I watched the readouts shift. Inside the testing chamber, the gravity increased, and I waited for Ethan to buckle, to strain, to show some sign that the crushing weight was affecting him. He stretched his neck, rolled his shoulders once, and said, "Ready." The cardiovascular test came first, a standard endurance run, 15 minutes at progressively increasing speeds. The Peluvian administrator started the clock, and Ethan began running. His form was efficient, economical, nothing wasted. His breathing remained steady, controlled, even as the treadmill speed increased. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. The human's pace never faltered. His expression never changed. When the timer chimed, he stepped off the treadmill, and his heart rate displayed on the overhead monitor was elevated but nowhere near the red zone. The observation gallery had gone quiet. Next came the strength assessment, and this was where things got interesting, or horrifying depending on your perspective. The administrator directed Ethan to the resistance bench, a machine that used magnetic fields to provide adjustable weight resistance. Standard protocol was to start at 50% of the species baseline and work upward until failure. For humans, the baseline calculations were pulled from the Academy's database, information that had been supplied by Earth's first contact delegation. Ethan positioned himself under the bar, gripped it with both hands, and waited. The administrator set the resistance to 180 pounds, the 50% starting point. The human lifted it smoothly, controlled, 12 repetitions without breaking rhythm. The weight increased, 220 pounds. Another 12 reps, just as smooth, 260, 290, 320. Kraktor, the massive Quarian, leaned forward in the observation gallery. "That's impossible. Those calculations must be wrong. No species that size should be able to move that kind of weight under that gravity." But Ethan kept going. 350 pounds, 380. His face had begun to show strain now, a slight redness across his cheeks, a tightness around his eyes, but he didn't stop. 400 pounds, 420. The bar was bending slightly under the magnetic resistance, something I'd never seen happen before. At 450 pounds he finally reached failure. He racked the bar, sat up, and calmly asked, "What's next?" The administrator just stared at him, all 6 eyes blinking in asynchronous confusion. Someone in the observation gallery whispered, "What in the name of the void is that thing?" The mockery had stopped. In its place, something else had taken root, a creeping, uncomfortable realization that maybe, just maybe, we'd made a terrible mistake. High-gravity worlds didn't just make you stronger, they made you into something that operated on an entirely different level, something that treated our normal as laughably easy. Ethan Cross wasn't struggling under 0.98 gravity. He was barely noticing it, and we were about to find out that physical strength was just the beginning of what Deathworld evolution had given humanity. The combat assessments were scheduled for the next day, and I remember lying in my bunk that night staring at the ceiling, wondering what fresh nightmare awaited us. I didn't have to wait long. The nightmare had a name, and it walked on two legs with a smile that never quite reached its eyes. Combat training started at 0600 hours in the main sparring arena, a reinforced space with adjustable gravity zones and medical teams standing by, because apparently, the Academy administrators had the foresight to realize that putting together 3,000 apex predators from across the galaxy and telling them to fight each other might result in injuries. Smart people. Those administrators, clearly smarter than the rest of us. The combat instructor was a Velcorian named Sergeant Drex, a species known for their military prowess and complete lack of humor. He stood 7 feet tall, covered in natural armor plating, and had forearms that ended in claws designed by evolution specifically for ripping things apart. He took one look at our assembled group, sneered in that way Velcorians do when they're not impressed, and announced that we'd be doing live sparring, no simulations, no safety protocols beyond the medical teams, real combat, real consequences, real opportunity to prove ourselves or get carried out on a stretcher. The rules were simple, hand-to-hand only, no weapons, no killing blows, tap out when you've had enough. Matches would continue until one fighter submitted or was rendered unable to continue. Gravity would be set to 0.7 as a compromise between species requirements. Drex paired us off based on weight class and perceived threat level, which meant most of the heavy hitters got matched against each other right away. Ethan got matched against a Korthan named Vilix. Now, Korthans are not small. They're not weak. They're amphibious, covered in thick rubbery skin, and possess tentacles that can exert pressure capable of cracking stone. Vilix was particularly large for his species, probably close to 300 pounds of muscle and attitude. When Drex announced the pairing, Vilix made this gurgling sound that passed for laughter among his kind and slithered into the combat circle with visible confidence. Ethan stepped in across from him, and I swear, the human looked bored. Drex signaled the start and Vilix moved fast, tentacles whipping forward to grab and constrict. Standard Korthan combat doctrine. Grapple, squeeze, wait for the opponent to pass out or beg for mercy. Ethan sidestepped the first tentacle, ducked under the second and then did something that made absolutely no sense. He stepped inside Vilix's reach, grabbed two of the tentacles and pulled. Korthans have incredible grip strength. What they don't have is great stability when something strong enough pulls them off balance. Ethan yanked, twisted his hips, and suddenly 300 pounds of surprised Korthan was airborne. Vilix hit the mat with a wet slap that echoed through the arena. Before he could recover, Ethan had positioned himself on top, one knee pressed against a major nerve cluster that even humans somehow knew about, and applied pressure. Vilix tapped out in under 30 seconds. The arena went silent. Then Sergeant Drex, in a tone that suggested he was reassessing his entire understanding of galactic biology, said, "Next." That's when things got entertaining if your definition of entertainment includes watching your fellow cadets get systematically dismantled by a Deathworlder who looked like he was practicing meditation techniques. A Draconid stepped up next, all scales and claws and fire-breathing heritage. Lasted 45 seconds before Ethan got him in a chokehold that cut off blood flow to his brain. A Thorian, built like a walking tank with natural bone protrusions, charged in with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. Ethan moved like liquid, redirected the charge, and introduced the Thorian's face to the mat repeatedly until submission was achieved. But here's the thing that really started to disturb everyone. Ethan was getting hit. These weren't clean victories. The Draconid's claws had raked across his forearm, leaving bleeding furrows. The Thorian had landed a solid hit to his ribs that should have cracked bone. A Silthian managed to bite his shoulder before going down, and Ethan just kept fighting. He'd acknowledge the injury with maybe a grimace, maybe a sharp intake of breath, and then continue like his body wasn't screaming at him to stop. By the third match the medical teams had started hovering closer. By the fifth match they'd stopped bothering to ask if Ethan needed treatment because he kept waving them off. Blood was dripping down his arm from multiple lacerations. There was a bruise forming along his jaw that was turning a truly spectacular shade of purple, and his knuckles were split and raw. Any sane species would have tapped out, sought medical attention, lived to fight another day. Ethan asked who was next. Kragtor, the Quarian who'd mocked him during orientation, stepped forward. Now, I'll give Kragtor credit, he wasn't stupid. He'd watched the previous matches, studied Ethan's patterns, identified weaknesses. Quarians are crystalline, which makes them hard to grapple but also vulnerable to impacts that can create fractures in their structure. The match lasted almost 3 full minutes, which was impressive. Kragtor used his reach advantage, kept Ethan at distance, landed several solid strikes that would have shattered a normal opponent's bones. Ethan absorbed the hits, waited for his opening, and when it came he moved. 1, 2, 3, rapid strikes to the same spot on Cractor's torso, exploiting the crystalline fracture points with terrifying precision. The Quarian's exoskeleton cracked, not enough to cause serious damage but enough to send pain signals that made him stagger. Ethan swept the legs, controlled the fall and applied an arm lock that threatened to snap off one of Cractor's limbs. The tap-out came immediately. When Cractor stood up, cradling his arm and trying to maintain some dignity, he looked at Ethan with something between respect and primal fear. The human was breathing hard now, finally showing signs of fatigue, his uniform soaked with sweat and decorated with his own blood, but he was still standing, still ready, still waiting. Sergeant Drex called an end to the session. The medical bay, he announced, was going to be busy enough without any more demonstrations. As we filed out, I passed close enough to Ethan to see his hands shaking, the adrenaline finally catching up with him, but his face remained neutral, controlled, like getting torn apart, and continuing to fight was just another Tuesday for him. Later in the medical bay, where half of Delta Wing was receiving treatment for various Ethan-related injuries, Thessia the Sylphine said what we were all thinking. That thing isn't normal, even for a Deathworlder. Something is fundamentally wrong with humans. A medical technician, a kindly Peluvian who'd been treating wounds for 15 years, looked up from bandaging Vilix's tentacles and offered some wisdom. High gravity doesn't just build strong muscles, it builds strong everything. Bones, tendons, pain tolerance, mental fortitude. Humans evolved in an environment that tried to kill them every single day. Their bodies learned to keep functioning long past the point where ours shut down. He paused, then added with a chuckle that sounded nervous. Also, their planet is apparently covered in things that want to eat them, so they developed this funny little survival trait called stubbornness. They don't quit, ever, even when they should. I thought about Ethan, still in the arena, finally accepting medical treatment for wounds that would have hospitalized most of us. I thought about how he'd fought through pain that should have been incapacitating. I thought about the casual, almost effortless way he'd dismantled opponents who outweighed him, outreached him, and had natural weapons he completely lacked. And I realized that the physical assessments, the combat training, all of it was just surface level. We hadn't even begun to understand what we were dealing with. The gravity chamber challenge was scheduled for next week, and rumor had it that Ethan had specifically requested, that his test be run at full Earth standard. Someone was going to die, I thought, and I was increasingly certain it wasn't going to be the human. The gravity chamber was the Academy's pride and joy. A technological marvel that could simulate gravitational conditions ranging from 0.1 all the way up to 15 times standard galactic normal. It was a massive spherical room, 50 meters in diameter, lined with gravitational field generators that could adjust on the fly and create zones of varying intensity. The chamber was used for advanced training, environmental adaptation studies, and most relevantly for us, the final physical qualification test that separated the cadets who merely attended the academy from those who actually graduated. The test was straightforward in concept, nightmarish in execution. You entered the chamber at your homeworld's gravity setting, completed an obstacle course that included climbing, crawling, sprinting, and lifting, all while the gravity gradually increased by 0.1 increments every 2 minutes. The goal was to complete as many laps as possible before your body gave out. The average cadet managed 3 laps before failure. The exceptional ones made it to 5. The record, held by a Thorian named Grath the Immovable, was 7 laps with a final gravity setting of 0.9. We assembled outside the chamber observation deck on a cold morning that felt heavy with anticipation. Word had spread about Ethan's combat performance, and now everyone wanted to see if the human could back up his apparent abilities in the one test that didn't involve punching people unconscious. The observation deck was packed, standing room only, with cadets from every wing crowding against the reinforced windows to get a view. Commander Vorask stood at the control panel, his massive Thorian frame hunched over the displays, while Sergeant Drex lurked nearby with his arms crossed. The first few cadets went through their tests in order of homeworld gravity, starting with the lowest. Sylvanian, whose species evolved in 0.4 gravity, managed a respectable 4 laps before collapsing in a heap at 0.6. The medical team extracted him quickly, efficiently, with the practice of people who did this every testing cycle. Thessia went next. She entered the chamber at her homeworld standard of 0.65, and I had to admit she was impressive. Her species' natural flexibility served her well in the tight crawl spaces, and her strength-to-weight ratio was excellent. She made it through 4 laps, finishing at 0.85 before her muscles simply refused to continue functioning. She exited the chamber with her head high, her scales shimmering with exertion, and her scores placing her in the 92nd percentile for Silthians. I went after her. 0.65 gravity, same as Thesia. The first lap felt easy, almost insultingly so. The second lap at 0.75 started to burn. By the third lap at 0.85 my legs felt like they were made of lead and my lungs were screaming. I pushed through sheer stubbornness, made it halfway through the fourth lap at 0.95 and my body decided it was done. I tapped the emergency cutoff, and the gravity mercifully returned to normal. 4 laps, 0.95 final gravity. Respectable but not record-breaking. Kragtor managed 5 laps, his crystalline structure giving him an advantage in raw strength even as the gravity climbed to 1.05. He exited the chamber breathing hard, which for Quarians meant their whole body was vibrating with the effort of oxygen intake. Vilix managed 3, about average, and seemed content with the result. Then Commander Vorask called out, "Cadet Cross, Ethan, human, you're up." The observation deck went absolutely silent. Ethan walked down from the staging area, still moving with that economical gait, still looking unremarkable despite everything we'd seen him do. He stopped at the control panel, and Vorask looked down at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Your homeworld gravity is listed as 0.98, Vorask said, his voice carrying through the observation deck speakers. "However, I see here you've submitted a request to run the test at 1.0 full Earth standard." Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir. 0.98 is the average. My specific training region was closer to 1.0, and I'd prefer to test under familiar conditions." Vorask studied him for a long moment, then made a noise that might have been approval or might have been disbelief. "Approved. Enter the chamber when ready." The human stepped through the airlock, and the chamber sealed behind him with a hiss of pressurized air. The gravity generators began their warm-up cycle, and the readouts showed the internal environment climbing from 0.7 station standard toward 1.0. I watched Ethan's posture, waiting for the inevitable adjustment, the bracing, the signs of strain as his body adapted to the increased weight. He rolled his shoulders once, bounced on the balls of his feet twice, and gave a thumbs up to the observation window. The course began. Ethan moved through the obstacles like they weren't even there. The climbing wall, which required hauling your full body weight plus equipment up a 15-meter incline, he scaled in under 40 seconds. The crawl tunnel, a claustrophobic nightmare that forced you to drag yourself forward using only your arms, he cleared without apparent effort. The sprint section, 200 meters of straightaway that had to be completed in under 60 seconds, he finished with time to spare. The weighted lift, requiring you to hoist a mass equivalent to your own body weight overhead 3 times, he completed with textbook form. Lap 1 complete. Gravity increased to 1.1. Ethan didn't slow down. If anything, he seemed to settle into a rhythm, his breathing controlled and steady. Lap 2 passed at 1.2 gravity. Lap 3 at 1.3. The observation deck had gone from silent to absolutely breathless. Cadets who'd been joking about the human just days ago were now pressed against the windows, watching in something approaching horror as he continued moving through obstacles that should have been crushing him. Lap 4, 1.4 gravity. Ethan's movements had changed now, becoming more deliberate, more careful. His face showed strain, sweat pouring down his temples, but he kept going. The climbing wall took longer. The crawl tunnel required visible effort. The sprint section had slowed to something closer to a jog, but he finished. Lap 5, 1.5 gravity. This was 50% higher than Earth standard, the equivalent of a human trying to function while carrying half their body weight as dead weight on every limb. Ethan approached the climbing wall, gripped the handholds and pulled himself up. Each movement was controlled, measured, his muscles trembling with effort, but never failing. The observation deck was full of whispers now, voices expressing disbelief in a dozen different languages. Lap 6, 1.6 gravity. Sergeant Drex had moved closer to the window, all 4 of his arms pressed against the glass. Commander Vorask was leaning over the control panel, watching vital signs that showed Ethan's heart rate in the red zone, his oxygen consumption off the charts, his body temperature elevated to levels that would have triggered medical intervention for most species. But the human kept moving. Slower now, significantly slower, but moving. He reached the weighted lift station, looked at the mass he was supposed to hoist, and I saw him laugh. Actually laugh. A sound picked up by the chamber's audio feeds, tinged with exhaustion and something that might have been hysteria. He gripped the weight, braced his legs, and lifted. Once, twice, 3 times. The weight went overhead each time, held for the required 2 seconds. then lowered with control. Lap 6 complete. Gravity increased to 1.7. Ethan stood at the start line for lap 7, breathing hard, his entire body shaking. He looked up at the observation window, made eye contact with someone. Maybe me. Maybe Vorask. Maybe just the universe in general, and smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a confident smile. A smile that said he knew exactly how insane this was and he was going to do it anyway. He took one step forward. Then another. The climbing wall loomed ahead. And under 1.7 gravity, it might as well have been a mountain. Ethan reached for the first handhold. Pulled. And made it maybe 3 meters up before his grip failed. He dropped. Landed hard. And I heard the air rush out of his lungs over the audio feed. The medical team started moving toward the chamber entrance. Commander Vorask's hand hovered over the emergency shutdown, but Ethan pushed himself to his feet, approached the wall again and started climbing. He made it 5 meters this time before falling, then 6 meters, then 7. On the 4th attempt he reached the top, rolled over the edge, and lay there for 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours. Then he got up and continued the lap. The crawl tunnel took him 5 minutes. The sprint section he walked, each step looking like it required a conscious decision to continue. The weighted lift he attempted once, failed, rested for 30 seconds while lying flat on his back, then tried again and succeeded through what I can only describe as sheer spite directed at the concept of gravity itself. Lap 7 complete. Final gravity 1.8. Ethan crossed the finish line, took 2 more steps and collapsed. Not dramatically. Not with flair, just a simple shutdown of a body that had given everything it had and finally hit empty. The medical team rushed in as the gravity returned to normal, surrounding him with scanners and emergency equipment. Commander Vorask's voice came over the intercom, and I'd never heard him sound shaken before. 7 laps. Final gravity 1.8. New Academy record by a significant margin. Someone in the observation deck, I think it was Kragtor, said quietly, How is that thing even alive? A medical technician's voice crackled over the comm. He's conscious, vital signs stabilizing. He's asking if he passed. Sergeant Drex turned away from the window, looked at all of us assembled cadets with his predator's eyes, and said something that crystallized everything we'd witnessed. That human just functioned in nearly double his homeworld gravity. He's either the toughest thing I've ever seen, or the stupidest, or both. Regardless, I never want to fight one. I realized then that we weren't looking at a cadet anymore. We were looking at a warning label, a preview of what an entire species from a death world could become when you gave them military training and pointed them at a problem. And the truly terrifying part was that Ethan Cross was probably average for a human. Somewhere out there in the galaxy, Earth was producing millions more just like him. Sweet merciful stars, what had we let into the Academy? The championship bout wasn't supposed to happen for another 6 weeks. But after Ethan's gravity chamber performance, the Academy administrators decided to accelerate the schedule, probably because they wanted to see what would happen when you put a Deathworlder against the station's reigning combat champion before the human had time to recover fully. Scientific curiosity, they called it. I called it barely concealed bloodlust from people who should have known better. The champion was a Valkorian named Thexeron, and if you've never seen a Valkorian in their prime, count yourself lucky or unlucky depending on your perspective. 8 feet of natural armor plating, 4 arms tipped with retractable claws, a tail that could shatter concrete, and a win record of 43 consecutive victories against opponents from across the galaxy. Thexeron had held the championship for 3 years, and rumor had it he was being scouted for the elite Imperial Guard. He was by every measurable standard the most dangerous thing at the Academy. The arena was packed for the fight. Every cadet who could get clearance crowded into the observation galleries, and those who couldn't watched via live feed from their barracks. The betting pools had reached absurd levels, with odds heavily favoring Thexeron. I'd seen a few brave souls place money on Ethan, but they were either wildly optimistic or suffering from some kind of death world-induced delusion. Ethan entered the arena still showing signs of his gravity chamber ordeal. There was a slight limp in his left leg, his ribs were taped from a fracture that hadn't fully healed, and the bruises on his arms had progressed through a rainbow of colors that medical science assured us was normal for human tissue recovery. He looked, to put it bluntly, like someone who should have been in a hospital bed not stepping into a combat ring. Thexeron looked at him and laughed. A sound like grinding metal plates. They send me a broken toy? Where is the sport in me? Ethan didn't respond. He simply moved to his starting position, rolled his neck once and settled into a stance that I'd seen him use before. Weight balanced. Hands up but loose. Eyes focused with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The match began, and Thexaron moved with the confidence of someone who'd never lost. He came in fast, all four arms working in coordination, claws extended, standard Valkorian doctrine, overwhelm with superior numbers of limbs, use the natural armor to absorb counterattacks, and finish with the tail strike. It had worked 43 times before. It should have worked again. Ethan moved like he'd been waiting for this exact attack his entire life. He slipped inside the claw strikes too close for the tail to be effective, and drove his elbow into the joint of Thexaron's lower left arm with surgical precision. The Valkorian's armor didn't cover the joints. Evolution's compromise between protection and mobility. The impact hyperextended the elbow and I heard the crack from the observation deck. Thexaron roared, more surprised than hurt, and swung with his upper right arm. Ethan ducked, swept low, and kicked out the champion's lead leg. 8 feet of armored Valkorian hit the mat hard enough to make the entire arena shake. Before Thexaron could recover, Ethan was on him, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone operating under injury. He got behind the Valkorian, wrapped his arm around the neck in a chokehold position, and locked it in with his legs braced against Thexaron's back. What followed was brutal. Thexaron thrashed, using his superior strength and mass to try to shake the human off. He rolled, slammed backward into the mat trying to crush Ethan, used his tail to strike at angles that should have broken ribs, and Ethan just held on, adjusting his position, maintaining the choke, his face set in an expression of grim determination that suggested he'd rather die than let go. 30 seconds passed. 40. Thexaron's movements became sluggish, oxygen deprivation affecting even his armored biology. At 55 seconds the champion tapped out, his hand slapping the mat 3 times in rapid succession. Ethan released immediately, rolled away, and stood up on shaking legs. His breathing was ragged, and I could see fresh blood seeping through his uniform where the taped ribs had taken damage. But he was standing, and Thexaron was on the ground, gasping for air and cradling his damaged arm. The arena was silent for 3 full seconds. Then someone started clapping, slow and deliberate. Others joined in, and within moments the entire observation deck was applauding. Some species stomping their feet, others whistling in their native styles. It wasn't just appreciation for a good fight, it was recognition, acknowledgement of something fundamental we'd all been forced to accept. Humans were dangerous. Not because they were the strongest, or the fastest, or had the best natural weapons. They were dangerous because they refused to quit, because pain was something they acknowledged and then ignored, because their Deathworld had spent millions of years teaching them that survival meant pushing past every reasonable limit. Ethan limped out of the arena to a standing ovation, and I noticed that even Sergeant Drex was nodding with what might have been approval. Commander Vorask was already on his communicator, probably reporting back to the Academy board that their human experiment had exceeded all expectations, and also maybe they should reconsider their entry requirements for Deathworld species. Later that evening, in the medical bay where both Ethan and Thexaron were receiving treatment, I overheard the champion say something that summed up everything we'd learned. I have fought Draconids and Thorians, Corians and Sylthians. I have won every time because I am stronger, better armored, more dangerous. But that human, he is something else. He is not stronger. He is not more dangerous. He simply refuses to accept that he should lose. How do you fight someone who has already decided they will not stop? The medical technician, the same Peluvian who'd treated us after combat training, chuckled and said, "You don't fight them. You pray they're on your side when the real war starts." I left the medical bay thinking about Earth, that blue-green death world spinning somewhere in Sector 7, producing these absolute monsters who walked around in soft skin pretending to be normal. The galaxy had no idea what was coming. Humanity had just joined the galactic community, and if Ethan Cross was any indication of their average capabilities, we were all going to have to recalibrate our understanding of what was possible. The mockery had stopped. The laughter had died. In its place was something between respect and existential dread, a recognition that we'd been very, very lucky that humans turned out to be friendly, because if they'd wanted to be conquerors instead of allies, I'm not sure anyone could have stopped them. 3 months have passed since Ethan Cross broke the gravity chamber record and defeated Thexaron in what everyone now calls the Deathworlders match. The Academy hasn't been the same since, and I mean that in ways both obvious and subtle. The most obvious change is that nobody makes fun of humans anymore. Not even as jokes. Not even behind closed doors, because word spreads fast in a military academy and everyone has heard what happens when you underestimate a species that evolved dodging predators in double gravity. The subtle changes are more interesting. The combat curriculum has been revised to include human fighting techniques. something called jujitsu that focuses on using an opponent's strength against them. The physical training programs now offer optional high-gravity conditioning for species who want to push their limits. And most telling of all, the Academy Board has issued new guidelines for evaluating candidates from high-gravity worlds. Guidelines that essentially amount to assume they're more capable than they look and test accordingly. Ethan graduated top of his class naturally. Last I heard, he'd been recruited by an elite tactical unit that specializes in hostile environment operations. They wanted someone who could function in conditions that would kill normal soldiers, and apparently Earth produces those by the millions. The recruiter told me they're planning to expand their human recruitment efforts, targeting Earth's military academies and special forces programs. I wished them luck and silently prayed for whatever enemies they end up facing. I graduated too. Respectable marks. Solid performance. Nothing record-breaking, but nothing to be ashamed of. I've been assigned to a peacekeeping force in the outer colonies, which suits me fine. Nice, quiet work, low-gravity planets, minimal chance of running into anything that wants to kill me. I've had enough Deathworld exposure to last a lifetime. But here's the thing that keeps me awake sometimes. Ethan was just one human. One average soldier from one average region of Earth. The planet has billions of them, and they're all built the same way. All products of the same brutal evolutionary pressure cooker. Earth's militaries have been training for large-scale warfare for thousands of years, refining techniques, developing strategies, producing soldiers who treat pain as an inconvenience and death as a possibility they've already accepted. The galaxy spent so long looking down on Earth, calling it a primitive backwater, mocking its high gravity and dangerous ecosystem. We thought we were superior, advanced, evolved beyond such harsh conditions. What we failed to understand is that harsh conditions don't make you weak, they make you harder than anyone who's never had to face them. The Academy now has 17 human cadets, and every single one of them performs like Ethan did, pushing past limits, breaking records, making the rest of us look soft and pampered by comparison. The instructors have stopped being surprised. They've started being cautiously excited about what it means for the future of galactic defense. Me? I'm just grateful humans decided to join the galactic community as friends instead of conquerors, because I've seen what one of them can do when properly motivated, and I have no desire to see what an entire planet of them could accomplish if they decided the galaxy needed new management. So here's my advice, free of charge from someone who learned this lesson the hard way. Never ever mock a human's homeworld gravity. Never assume they're weak because they look soft. Never think you've won just because you landed a hit, and for the love of everything you hold sacred, never challenge one to a physical contest unless you're prepared to have your entire understanding of biological limits completely destroyed. They come from a death world. They're built to survive where nothing else can. And the truly terrifying part is, they don't even realize how abnormal they are. To them, this is just normal. This is just Tuesday. The galaxy is going to have to get used to humans because they're not going anywhere. And honestly, after seeing what they can do, after watching Ethan casually accomplish things that should have been impossible, I think